Hey everybody, some gadget guy here, finally getting my hands on the Lumia 830, Nokia Microsoft's mid-range phone masquerading as a flagship. The camera steps down from the half-inch sensors found on truly high-end Nokias to a 1/3 inch sensor, similar in size to what you might find on an iPhone 6 or LG G3, and it retains Nokia's terrific hardware optical image stabilization. Starting off with some bright outdoor sunlit scenes, the color saturation and contrast are really juicy. It's a bright, punchy exposure style which just borders on being oversaturated. Blues and greens look exceptional, and fine detail is retained in most scenes until you start drifting into trouble colors. This exposure style makes yellows and reds a bit problematic, but thankfully Nokia software tends to avoid some of the extreme overexposure issues we've seen on recent Android devices. Macro distances for the 830 are actually a touch better than what you might find on the 1520 or 930. Getting up close and personal wasn't much of an issue at all, and pushing the camera to its minimum focusing distance, you can then also employ the software zoom to get even closer. Even with a 10 megapixel sensor, you still have plenty of travel on that resampling zoom, and it just further cements Nokia's approach as the best for smartphone photos and videos. While you can see a fair amount of sharpening at the far end of the zoom, I think you still end up with a more pleasant image fully zoomed in than you might get with the iPhone 6. Into a walking test, few phones handle this kind of movement well, and the 830 is doing better than most. The hardware image stabilization creates a jello-y wobble to the video as it tries to compensate for footfalls, and while it's certainly a subjective preference, I prefer the look of this style of stabilization to software-based solutions. Into a scene with a lot of movement, the autofocus is very calm, with few readjustments after settling in on the stable elements in the scene. Occasionally you'll see a twitch as a car passes really close to the lens. Its solid performance marred only by the fact that you cannot select a focus point while rolling video. Dynamic range is pretty terrific considering the amount of saturation and contrast baked into the video. While white cars are starting to clip, we see an almost unreal blue in the sky, with some detail still being retained in the clouds. Again, I'd also like to point out the greens in the scene are super vibrant. I know a lot of this is based on oversaturation tricks, but it's a really pleasant and colorful result. We see the same stability in autofocus and the same exposure and saturation performance in our freeway test, doing a wonderful job showing off a gorgeous fall day in Los Angeles. The 830's 3-microphone array doesn't perform quite as well here as the quad array on the 930 or 1520, but it's still more than a match for phones like the One M8 and Note 4, and it's in a completely different league than the iPhones and LGs we've tested. Nokia's combination of low-cut filtering and noise reduction is simply superb. Onto a transition test, this is still one area where Windows Phone lags a bit behind. Moving from dark to light and back to dark, changes feel buzzy or stuttery, that there are noticeable stepped changes in exposure to compensate. There's a pulsing quality as the app makes those adjustments. Happily though, there is no change in frame rate in any shooting condition, and the camera never drops below 30 frames per second. A quick chat on depth of field. As we're dealing with a 1/3 inch sensor, it's not surprising that performance here is similar to what we might see on an iPhone or LG. Working at macro distances, you can get the background to blur, but otherwise, detail behind your subject will often still be recognizable. Nokia has pushed the 830 into a position where it too represents the absolute best image we can squeeze out of this sensor size, while competing with phones that cost significantly more. Still, you won't see that buttery smooth bokeh that you might find on a phone like the Lumia 1020. Into a nighttime street scene, we see the same problem here with the 830's autofocus getting easily confused in low light situations. All of my shots at night required me to pre-focus before pushing record. After focusing, we get a pretty good image with a terrific frame rate, and I always appreciate Nokia's decision to subtly underexpose a scene and increase ISO noise rather than scale back that frame rate. There is, however, a bit more chroma noise on this video than previous Lumias we've reviewed. Little blue and red speckles throughout the shot, which are exactly exacerbated whenever white or bluish headlights travel through the scene. We see a really blocky and artifact-heavy noise creep throughout our other low-light tests. Thank Thankfully, we don't see any serious issues with white balance. Our creepy tunnel scene has about the right gross yellow color washing the face, with blue-white lights traveling down the tunnel. Ditto our creepy gate. Again, white balance veers towards retaining the actual color of the lighting in this scene, then trying to expose for some notion of true scientific white. Though, the noise in these scenes does border on distracting. On our walkway scene, blocky artifacts aside, again we see very good delineation between these two lights, which aren't quite the same shade of white and absolutely drive me nuts whenever I walk by them, and I should totally write a letter to our HOA. And lastly, a flower lit in almost zero light. Ultra low light conditions like these improve the situation with chroma noise, as there's just way less color info in general, but the luminance noise is so severe it looks like swarms of bugs are crawling over the entire scene. So where does that leave us with Microsoft's mid-ranger? The Lumia 830's camera is definitely mid-range fare, and it does ask us to make a few mid-range compromises, but it continues a tradition of Nokia Microsoft phones punching way above their weight. The 830's camera might feel like a step down from phones like the 1020 or 1520, but it's an able competitor against phones from Apple and LG at much higher price points. In most shooting scenarios, it provides excellent results, and probably won't feel like much of a compromise for folks looking to make the switch to Windows Phone. As always, thanks so much for watching my videos. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed this review, and I would not be able to continue producing videos like these if you all weren't out there sharing them with your family, friends, and on social media. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.